PHP unit testing is the ultimate way of improving our code quality, in my opinion, because if our code is easy to test, then usually it's easy to refactor and easy to maintain, easy to improve. Tests can also speed up some parts of development and give us a peace of mind when we are doing very tricky and difficult changes to our existing code. If you ever needed to change some code but was afraid that you will break something, then this method will help you. And for me, writing tests was actually the career changing habit that I got, as it really improved the code I was writing and making me more confident on refactoring existing code, being the code owner. By the way, if you're not interested in our CMS series, you can just go to this timestamp for the unit testing itself, but it could be a good idea to watch everything so that you know why we are writing these tests at all. So our CMS here now needs to list all the pages from database. This is where we left off last time. And we have our active record pattern implemented already for communicating with the database. So we will work on it and expand its functionality. So in our entry PHP file, here we have this find by method that can find us one of the entities from the database, right? Something that we used in pages and routers, if you remember. So on our website here, when we get the page from the database, this page information is being fetched via that find by method, where we pass the field name and the value, like in this page controller here, for example. This find by method that actually retrieves the page based on the entity ID that we give it. And now we need another method in beside this find by, for example, find all, which will logically find us all the pages in our database. So let's make that method here. It will be the public function, find all, and for now it will go without parameters. And we can actually just copy everything that's in this find by method to save some time. Now we don't need this where over here, so we'll just remove it. And now this part can be a bit tricky, so please follow carefully. I will try to explain what's happening. This now returns only one data, this find by. So it sets the values to this very object, in our case, this page object here. So once we call find by, this object, the new page object here, it gets populated with the data from the database. That is why we have this set values, which just sets the values to this very object. This, in this case, refers to this page object, right? Now for the find all, we need to return multiple objects actually. So instead of this fetch, we are going to use the fetch all. If you check out the PHP documentation, on the PDO, it has this fetch all. And the fetch all does pretty much the same thing as the fetch, except that it gets multiple rows from the database, which is exactly what we need. So let me just show you what is going on once more time. This database data, if I would to var dump it, when we fetch one page, we can see that we get one array with the About Us page content. And this is from the router, so let's just ignore that one. But we get one record with the ID2, title About Us, and the content About Us page. This is basically what we are seeing here, right? So a single level array. Now, if I would to dump that database data here, first I would need to call this method, right? And we can do that in our admin pages controller. And here in default action, I will just make a page handler object, which will be a new page, and it needs a database, right? We can just copy what we have in the public portion, where we get the database instance, and we pass that database connection to the page object. Now, if this page handler would to find all, it will return us the pages, and that pages will actually be an array of objects, or it will be when we make it, right? Let me just call this just to see what's going on from the administration. And we see a bunch of errors. Just remove this HTML here. But apart of some values missing, we now see that we get an array of arrays. So there is a slight difference than what we have here in the public, where we have a single level array, right? Because these are multiple rows in the database, right? So what that means is that we have to loop these results over here inside of our entity find all, and for each and every row of these values now, we have to make new objects, right? Because this is now a universal class, so there are a few things that we can do. So now if there is data in database, right, we can do the for each of same database data as the object data, let's call it like that. And as mentioned, we need to make a new object. But what is that object going to be called? We are not going to hard code it because as you remember, here in public, we use this active record for multiple type objects. This one is for the router and this one is for the pages. So we have to be dynamic. We have to be careful about that. So the object or the class name rather can be this predefined value that PHP has that is called static class, which is a magic constant, and that will just give us back the class name that is making this object in this page controller. It will be the page because the entity is a abstract class being inherited, if you remember. So we cannot just say entity, we have to use the children of this class, and we will get that here. We can even move this outside of for each because it's needed for in the for each. So now we can make a new object of the class name type. And if you recall, our objects, just as we did now inside of our administration here, it needs the database connection, and that we already have in this entity because we are passing it in this database connection or DBC value here. So we can just pass it down the line. And then we will do the same. We will just set values for this object. But now we are, today we are just setting values to this very object here using this variable. That has to change now because we now need to pass values to this very object here that we just created. So we'll just make one more parameter here that we are going to pass. And instead of using these fields, we are going to use the fields on this object, right? But now this value is being used on the find by. So here as well, we have to pass the object that we want to change. And if you remember, here we just changed this to object, right? Which means that that object here has to become this because we are again setting the values of the object that is actually calling our database, our active record, right? So we want to set on the very caller of the active record. In case you are not familiar with this, again, this here references the very object that we are working in. So not the class. You remember that the class makes the objects the final objects, right? So now we are inside of the class, which is just a factory, a way of making the actual objects in memory. So using this is a way to referring to the actual object that is being created from that class. So not the page, but actual page handler, or in this public case here, this page object that's being created using this class. If this is a bit difficult, please write me a comment and I will make an entire video about this reserved variable here, because it's not that easy concept to understand, especially if you're just beginning. But let's continue with fixing our code. Now here we need to return the actual results. We don't have a variable for results, so let's just make one. This results will be an empty array here at the beginning. Let's return this object here and put it inside the results, right? So that we return it outside of this class. And then this set values will actually return back this object. There are a lot of ways that this can be solved. I will just return it from here. You can do it by reference or whatever. Now let's see in administration how this behaves. There is a lot of missing values on entity line 38. Let's see what's complaining there. And that is this field value. That's the part of the filter. We don't need that for now. Let me remove this field again. Now we see that we get an empty array, which is not something that we planned, but let's debug. Let's see what happened actually. Let's actually dump this class name just to be double sure what happened. I'll just use var dump. That is empty. Let's go one step above and see what database data is. And that one is empty as well. So let's see now the SQL or this debug parameters. Oh yes, I removed the entire line here that was supposed to execute this. So here we need to say the stmt execute, right? I should have just removed the parameter from it, but now it should work fine. And see what now the error is. And there is undefined ID on the entity line 55. And that is basically these fields name and this field being set. And that is because I forgot to change these set values. It's not database data, but it is object data now because we are one level in. That's why I mentioned it's tricky. It's tricky even for me. But finally, if I refresh, we can see there is some data over here. And now we can see pretty much the page 1, home page, welcome to the page, and the about us page, and the thank you page for the contact, thank you for your message, account pages, and pretty much everything. And this is the reason why Active Record is a bit difficult to work with, at least for me personally, because sometimes it will set itself as a value, like here in the page controller, so in the public page controller. So this find by method will actually set the page object itself to a proper active record, the object. But sometimes when you're returning multiple things, it will actually return you the array of objects that you want to work with, which it's just difficult to remember. And that is why I personally prefer the data mapper ORM. But we will stick to active record because it's generally easier to work with and it's more popular. So you might use it more in real life. And let's check some public pages that they are still working, like this about page, contact us page, home. Now everything is fine with using the find by method. So now we just need to loop over these objects here in our template, right? Because we have a page object here and multiple page objects that we want to actually show in this list over here. Let's just update our template. So inside of our modules, we have this page admin views page list method that we stopped last time with. Let me just find this string so that I don't have to scroll a lot. So there is a new line for each of those rows displayed. Since we are looping, we are just going to keep one line and we are basically going to loop over the variable for each. But the variable that we are going to loop is not being set. So we are just going to set these variables of key pages having the value of our newly fetched pages from the database, right? So I will just loop the pages in our template engine as page. Let me just close this loop so I don't forget about it. Now each page will have its own line, right? And here we can just dump out the page ID. Here we can have the page name, right? The created by, we don't need that. And we don't need all these avatars, so I'll just remove that. Instead of project name, I can just change it to page name. And that's pretty much it. We only need some actions, right? The page ID and the page name are sufficient for now. And this will be the, it's not the ID. What was the name? It was title, right? The property title. I will just remove everything from this. Let's see what happens now. So we have in our administration list of pages, of all the pages in database. So the page name, home page, about us page, thank you, contact us page, and everything. And this is the reason why template engines, by the way, exist like Twig or Symfony, because then you would not write this PHP code inside HTML here. So if you use something like Twig from Symfony or Blade for Laravel, they make writing this HTML logic here much easier. So you can try to implement Twig, for example, if you feel like it is very powerful to use. But now let's go back to our code. And here inside the entity, you probably noticed that we just duplicated a bunch of code here, and it's pretty much doing the same thing. Find all and find by are very similar, almost identical, except for this multi-level of arrays here. Now, to fix this, to remove this duplication, there are a dozen ways you can fix this, but I will skip a few steps ahead and just do it the way CodeIgniter does it, or it used to do it. So we can refactor this so that we extract this portion, this selecting from database, and this looping outside of these functions into one third method that will actually not be available to classes using our active record, but they will be just used internally because we might have a lot of find all, find by, or filter by, or something more that we might need here. And we just want these functions to be sort of like a facade, sort of like a front end to our active record, so that people don't go in and do some things that they are not supposed to do. And that way we can just make it easier for developers, or in our case ourselves, to work with our active record, to have a bit simpler interface towards more complex functions. And this will be very useful when we are going to make, for example, a search, or the pagination, for example, or grouping the results, etc. So if I would to make one internal or the private method name find, and this is something where basically we can just remove everything from find all right into this find, and from find all we are just going to make a facade or a interface, and we can just return this again, find method back, and we can see that our listing is still working fine, except that it doesn't. This variable, of course, it's not it's return, and now it does. But there is a slight difference from the find by and find all, because I just obviously copied one line. Now, I could just go one line by line here and move this code here and then just hit refresh a few thousand times to check that both listing and both single fetching is working. And in this case, it's not that difficult to do because we just have two methods and two pages. But very soon, as we continue adding functionality, this very code here, as you see, is used by pretty much all the objects in our case. So this find and find all, it might be used in 10 or 50 or 200 different scenarios and could be very, if not impossible, to test manually. Then you will have to do pretty much all the actions around the website just to test that some change is working. And nobody's going to do that in real life, but luckily, since we know how to write programs, we can make a small program that will do this testing for us. Or we can write an automated test. And what automated testing is, it is a process of writing additional code that will actually test our main code. Now, there are entire courses on automated testing and even entire careers of people who are testing, but here are some basics. There are a few methods of automated testing in software, like unit testing, integration testing, functional testing, keyword testing, integration data-driven, etc., etc. Some tests are there to test the code base, but some tests, like functional tests, for example, can actually open the browser and then type something in the browser, log in, click around to see if the page is working for us, to see if everything is working as expected when you click some of the buttons. So we write a small programs that the computer does the testing for us. Instead of us manually testing every functionality by hand, we can write a small program, mini program that will automatically test some parts of our program as many times as needed. In practice, we just cannot test everything manually, as it takes way too much time. But the computer, on the other hand, it's very good of not getting tired or not complaining or not being irritated if we just keep making mistakes and keep asking it to test the same thing. It will just do what it's taught. It will keep testing. So automated tests give us the confidence that our code works as it should, which is especially useful for important things like the active record, for example, or the validation or database class, or maybe a shopping cart where you're working with numbers and money, etc. And also, as mentioned, writing the tests, or at least being very familiar with the process of writing the tests, will improve our code architecture and code quality, because for our code to be testable, it needs to be simple, isolated, and generally it needs to follow good practices. So if you start writing some tests, but you're really struggling to completely write test cases for some part of your code, that's usually a good indication that you should start refactoring and improving that code base. Today we will talk about unit testing, the way of testing. It's one of the test methodologies focused on a small part of the actual code base. So tests could, for example, test the entire active record or the database, and we can take small pieces from our code and test a bunch of things. We can test the find by and find all and find methods. Or for database, we can test the connection, the query all, or for router, redirection, etc. Because I talked about refactoring again in pretty much each of my videos, because it's that important. And on your job, especially as a beginner, you are rarely going to get a task to write everything you are really passionate about. You're not going to get a task to make a CMS from the blank page, for example, because that CMS will most likely fail from a business perspective. You are there to solve problems, and you will in majority of cases be maintaining some existing code base that might be old, that might be ugly, and might not even follow good programming standards. And believe me, every application, every company has a part of the code that looks like that. And that is why refactoring is a very important skill and also a mentality to have, and to help us with refactoring, to gain us the confidence that we are doing the right thing, we can use automated testing. The benefits of unit testing, and probably all the other automated testings in general, are easier way to find and fix the bugs, because you can just run the tests, and if something has changed and some of the code is not working as it should, the test will show you that. You can even automate the testing with deployment tools, so the moment you are about to deploy your code, the tests are being run, and the deployment process itself will help you and tell you if there is a bug on the way out to production, which is something that we don't want. Another benefit is having more robust code, because when you know that you are about to test that code, you are writing it in such a way that it has the single responsibility principle. You are writing it so that it can be tested, so that it's doing a small thing that it should do, and that you can easily confirm that its functionality is there working as it is. The better code quality is also an advantage of writing tests, again, for the same reasons, because if something is very difficult to test, usually means that the code is clunky, it does too many things, it is too long, it's unpredictable, and we don't want such code. We want that code that we can reliably test and that we can rely on. Again, it's easier refactoring because you have the tests for all the difficult scenarios. If you're, for example, testing the shipment class, where you have a lot of edge cases for some products to get a free shipping, some get different kind of shipping, so you can put all your tests for all the different type of products and you can just run it and see that it's handling correct numbers and correct prices for everything, or the shopping cart or the vouchers or whatever. Again, it's easier to refactor code because you are certain that your code is still working when you run the tests that you have. And they can also document the code, because once you go through the tests, you can see what are expectation of the test, right? If you get a voucher, for example, in a test, you can see how the code is expected to behave. For example, if a product is free, there should be an email sent, and you can see all those things inside the tests, especially in a huge code base. And some methods of unit testing are test-driven development, which tests the state of the code where, and this is a very powerful way of writing code, because you would first write the test that would fail, and then you would make the code that will make your tests pass, right? To continue from there, the typical red-green refactor cycle. But you can also use this method when refactoring and when you are about to fix some bug. And this is my personal favorite way of testing, since I generally write tests sporadically, only when I really see the benefit of it, especially in small projects, like in this case testing the active record. Firstly, because it is a crucial component to our application, and secondly, there are so many variations that I would not have a chance to remember all the use cases and all the proper ways of testing. I would have to write a huge document with all things I should remember to test, and since I am about to write a document, I might as well just write some code that will do the same testing for me. It will do the same documentation for me. So now we are going to write some tests that will fail, and then we are going to make our code work to by following those tests themselves. I also like to write some tests when bug happens, especially if it happens more than once. I would then write a test that should give me the correct results and then fix the code until everything works as it's supposed to, just to be sure that the same bug does not happen again. And other methods like behavior-driven development actually test the complete behavior of a software. And here you're more involved with project owners, the similar for acceptance test driven development, which are usually used in larger companies on larger projects and usually involve more people than a typical web developer scenario. Does this theoretical explanation make any sense to you? Please write me a comment if you have any question, and I also kindly ask you to subscribe and share this video so that others can benefit from it. It takes me a lot of time to make them, but it really warms my heart when I see people watching and commenting on these videos. But enough theory, let's write some code. Now, luckily, when it comes to unit testing, a lot of things are already invented for us so that we can use the most popular unit testing framework. So if we would to Google for a PHP unit test, one of the first link is phpunit.de, which is a framework, the most popular framework for testing, and it's very easy to use. We can take the first step by installing it. We can just run from the console the Composer require, or you can use par if you're not using Composer. I'm actually going to use Composer because pretty soon in the future we are going to use the Composer autoload file to get rid of all of our includes and requires. So for us, the Composer makes more sense. By the way, make sure that you have Composer installed. If not, you can just install it from here following the documentation. I already have it installed, so I will just run this from the console. And once that is installed, I should be able to see a new file here, the composer.json and the composer log in my project, as the same time as the vendor folder where the composer will put its dependencies. If I were to open our composer JSON, I can see that our project requires PHP unit now. We are not going to go into the auto loading still. I will make a new video about it because it's a bit tricky. But we can now actually run this command from the command line to verify that our tests framework is installed and it's working, and it's giving us the PHP version by Sebastian and contributors, and that is great. That's what we need. Now the installation should be as easy as this what I showed, but if it sometimes fails, you just have to be persistent and try some different methods of installing it. So let's make a folder tests as explained here. In the test code, it's easiest to have a folder named tests, right? And inside we can make one test that I have here. We can just copy this file from here, this content, into one new file named record test. I believe that all test files have to end with the word test, and the same for the classes and the methods. They have to end with test and they have to begin with test. Now let me tidy it up a bit. So it's not the email test, we have the active record test, right? And it is extending the test case, which is actually our framework. Now, if I would run the command for running tests, it should fail, I guess, but let's just see how it fails. And it says that no tests executed, but it is complaining about something. Oh, it's not, because I have this too close. Let's run it one more time. And it says that there are failures, and that the class email is not found, because this is just a copy paste. Of course, it's not found. But let me just assert true a simple thing, just so I can show you how this works. Now, if I would run this one, it says that one test has failed because one is not true. And that is correct. The true should be true. One more time. Okay, so we have one test that has passed. 1 out of 1, which is 100% success. Yes, our application is working. Not really. The way the tests are working in practice is that you would usually assert something to something. The most popular is to assert equal, where you will have the expected value, which could be 1, and then you are going to put here some expression or some of your code or some of the classes or some methods that will basically do the 1 plus 1, for example, and here we can say that it's 2. If I would to run this test now, this test does not make any sense, but let's just run it. It will show that 1 has succeeded, and that's great. That's perfect. And that is the fun part. Let's test some real code. Before starting with active record, I will actually start with the authentication class, because the active record has a bit of is a bit more involved, and the out class is a bit easier to show because we don't need autoloaders and everything. So let me make one validation test. And in that file, we are going to paste pretty much everything that we have over here. So this will be the validation test. And if you remember our validation that we are using in the admin dashboard module, the controller here, it can validate a lot of different things, but one of the things it can validate is the email, for example. And we can write a test that will check if our validation is correct, if it's working fine. So we can here say test validation email, and we can say validation class equals to new validation, and one of the validation rules is the email, so we can just say validation class add rule new validate email, right? Now again, because we don't have the autoloader yet, we will have to include our files here. So we could just say require once the source validation.php, and the same for our validate email class, right? Which is inside the validation rules over here. But we also need this validation rule interface as well. If I would to run our tests again, we can now see that there are two tests being successful, because this test is not doing anything. So if I would to check that this class would now actually validate the value of email, which could be test@email.com, I could actually validate assert true or expect that this validate method for this validate email is true, because if we go inside of our validate email, it is returning true if the filter for the email is passing, right? So it's returning false if the email is not valid. Let's run one more time. Still, we have two tests working. Just to make sure that it's not working, I will just assert false here and then run the tests again. And now we can see that there is one failure because failed to assert that true is false, which is correct. But what we can do is we can say that this is true, but this false should be 1, 2, 3, for example. If I would run this now, we have 2 tests and 3 assertions and everything is working correctly. Now, one little tip, because I'm now looking at this console here, a lot of IDEs have the plugin that will help you with testing, and the NetBeans has actually this test plugin here, so I can, from the profile, I can just test the entire project. But for it to work, because we don't have the autoloader, I just have to put the entire absolute path here. So let me just put the complete path to the file. And I can actually run this plugin now, where I can just run all the tests, or I can just choose one of the tests, or only the failed tests, etc. And it helps to visualize the tests and the code and what is going on. So if you're using the Visual Studio Code, for example, or any other editor, you can find something similar usually that will help you, or you can just use the command line for now. But in essence, this is all there is to it for testing. You just write few codes offline and you can test the entire class and make sure that validation in our example, for example here, is working correctly. Now, as mentioned before, we can now just write a new test before we continue with our changes for our existing code, and then we can write the test that we know will fail because during our process of validation of refactoring, it will fail on the different methods, but we don't have to go to browser to refresh. We can just run our code all the time and see if it's working correctly. So now for our active record here, I would need to include everything that's active record related. Again, this is just a temporary workaround. We will fix that in next lesson. So here we need our entity. But also, since the entity is, if you recall, the abstract class, means that you cannot initiate it by itself. We have to inherit it. So we can just use the pages here from our page module. So I'll go to modules, page, and the models and the page.php itself. You need to fix all these directory separators in your project. If you're not working on Windows, for me, sort of doesn't matter because I will just will include the autoloader in the next lesson. But let's start by testing the find all, where we are going to make a new page equals new page. Now, if you recall, the page actually requires us to pass the database connection here. And that is what I meant with a bit more involved testing. But the beauty of the object-oriented programming, or better say it, a good structured code, is that since our page gets the dependency, it's using dependency injection design pattern here, we can actually provide to the page a fake database connection or a test database connection. And we will talk more about dependency injections here, or you can even watch the free lesson from my PHP design pattern course. I will put a link in the description and in the tab so that you can get familiar with what dependency injection is. But again, we can provide the fake database connection, and we know what this page is doing with our database. Just close this terminal. We can see that the database connection is just being passed to the parent class, which is entity in this case. And in entity, database connection is used to prepare query. We don't need all that functionality. We just need a mini class here that we can even create here or include it or export it. For now, I will just keep it here. We can just call it fake database connection, right? It has a method prepare, right? There's no parameters to it needed. We just need it to be there. And this prepare will actually return, if we look at our page controller here, our entity here, it will return one STMT object which has an execute and fetch properties on it. So let me just copy this code because it's easier to follow. I can just put it here. Now again, this database connection will prepare, but it will return then a STMT. So we can just make one more class of fake STMT object, which will have the execute. And since again it's fake, we don't need it to do anything. But this fetch method over here, that fetch method will actually return us something, and this fetch method will actually returns the database data. So we can connect this to the database, but we can also just say return an array of pages or the array of the database records. If you recall in our dumps, let me just quickly dump one find by, the find all. So here we have our data that lies in database. As you remember, it's an array of arrays with values. So we can now just make one array of arrays of values, right? The ID equals to 1, and the next one is a title. So the title will be some fake title, and the content, same thing. Now what we did, we actually mocked the entire database here. We just injected a fake database to our class, because our class does not care where the data is coming from, right? It's isolated. The page does not care about the work of a database. So if I would to run this test result now, we can see that there is an error, and the test find all fails because there are too few arguments for the page construct, which is correct because we didn't even make this fake database connection, right? Fake database connection. So let's just make one. New fake database connection, right? And it is complaining that we did not perform any assertion, which again is correct because we forgot to do any assertion. And that is this assert true, assert false. Now we can assert a bunch of different things. You can choose yourself what makes more sense. But we can, for example, usually assert equals or any of these values here, empty or whatever. But we can equals that the count of pages here, the count of results is 1 in this case. So we can say the count of results that this page API will do. So we will have the page objects here, or the result, right? Result will be what our page is returning with the find all. If you are a bit lost, we are still testing the find all method, right? So this count should be 1. Let's run that one to see what happens. And it fails in the entity line 4335. So we can see what's going on over there. And that is the execute method, which we actually written wrongly. So it does not accept any parameters here. If I remove that and run it one more time, we can then see that there is some method being executed on null, meaning that some object is not correctly initiated. That is again because this prepare should return the new fake stmt that we forgot to put over here. And then we just continue running and testing and see what the next thing. So the class fake stmp is not found. That is because it's wrong spelling. One more time. Now we are not returning it. It's very easy to debug. You just follow what you do wrong. Now the fetch all is newly created method that we didn't include here, but we are going to work with the fetch all because I copied from the find by. If we continue with our tests, now the variable results is undefined, and that is because again I did some small mistake here. And now everything passes, which means that this results find all is returning 1. So if we would now to add another array here with 2 and fake title 2, right? We can now run our tests again, and we can see that the test is failing because 2 does not match as 1, but that's easy to fix because we now control the data being returned and we can control the data being given. But we can make even more precise asserts depending on what you need to test actually. So we can say that the first object from the result, which is null, right, is the object. We know that that's the page object because now find all will return us the objects, the array with objects, So it should have the value, the ID being the 1 because that's the one we are giving. We can even give 12 here and then assert that the first page inside of our results is giving us the ID 12. Run that test again. Everything is working fine, which means that we are now confident that what we have here is working. It's what should be working. So we know that find all works fine, works as it's supposed to do. And now we are about to refactor our code inside the entity, right? The fun part now. Now we are going to remove this find by query from here, and we are going to refactor this find by to work with this find, the similar method that the find all is working. So let's make one test for the find by. I will copy this find all to have the find by method. Before I forget, here we will call find by, and the fields will be ID and the ID with value 2. Now this will set this page to the values from the database, so we don't need these results. However, we can assert equal that, or we can assert true this page now, or sorry, it's better to assert equals that this page now that we are going to get, that we made, its ID will be set to 2 or to 12 rather, because that's the first one. I will show you why, because we are not actually doing the querying, but the principles are the same. If we were to run all tests, expectedly the other one will fail now, and that's because there is no fetch method on the fake STMP. And that is good because in our entity, as mentioned, we want to get rid of this fetch. We don't actually want this fetch to be called. We want this find by method to actually do the same thing as the find all, right? But now it's very easy for us to refactor because we are confident that the find all is working fine. So we can just return this find. And since we have this field name, field value here, I'll just pass them to the find and put them here. Before I forget, there is this where that we need to append to the SQL. So if field name is being passed, we can just say that the SQL needs to be appended with our where clausal. We will change this to be a dynamic to use the object-oriented principles, right? Use the actual objects, but for now this will work fine. And these fields have to be optional because we are using them here inside the find all, right? Now before I forget, we remove this execute here, which needs this prepared fields, right? So we can just make one prepared fields array that defaults 20. And here we can populate it by having the prepared fields to match our values that are passed in. For now, it will work just fine. We will, of course, refactor it and improve it. Let's run our test. Let's see where the fail is now. Now there is undefined property page ID. We can see the output with more details. So here we can see all of our dumps. And we can see that this var dump is actually giving us the two fake values, the fake title and the fake content, right? And that the result now is an array of objects, which is not something that we expect from the find by, right? Now there is some problem that needs to be fixed. If you remember, this is now an array with arrays, and it's returning the arrays with objects, right? Which is not something that the find by is expecting. So what we need to do now is to set these values to this rather than having setting values to this object here, right? Which means that pretty much this data from here needs to be moved to each and individual find methods. So here we are just going to have this return the database data, have the results predefined here, and then return results. If I would just remove this return results here and run the tests, we can see that even find test all is failing. And that is correct because now we are doing refactoring and we haven't returned anything. So if I remove this, run the tests again, I don't have even to open my browser. I can see that this failed to assert to that 0 is matching 2. And why is that? That is an excellent question. And the answer is that we are now returning the results instead of this database data. Again, we just run the results and we can see that find all works again. No reason to open the editor. We can even have these tests being run on each and every page save so that some editors allow that, and that's a very useful feature. So each time you save, it will just run the tests for you and you can immediately see what's going on without even touching the console. And now we are almost close to the finish line. One more change here. We need to do the same here. So the results will be what's returned, right? And if the result is true and if there is a result on the place of 1 in this array, which is just the first array we are interested in, right? Because this has the where on the ID, so it will return us array within an array, but it will be only one result because there is a single result from the database, right? We can say the same as here, this set value, or rather this that we had before, that we knew it's working, to the this object. Now instead of database data, it's the result. And this method actually doesn't need to return anything because it's setting the values on its own. Let's see our tests now. And there is undefined index ID. And that is because in our tests, So we can see that we have the array with two values, right? Which means that for these results, we need to set the result of the first one, right? Run the tests again. And we can see that all of our tests work, all of our tests are passing, which means that both listing of these pages here inside the administration is working, it is showing us all the pages, but also all these pages in the public part, the about us, the contact us pages, and the home page is working. Besides this dump, right? Let me remove that one just so that we have something prettier. Our entire website is working, and we changed a lot of things, and we are confident that this is not needed and that this find by and find all and this find method are working as they are expected. Now I find this really cool feature because there is a little helper in my PC, in my editor, that is going around and testing my code. And obviously this test code that we wrote in here, it's just a demo. It does not cover nearly all the cases that we want to cover. But I hope that you can see how this can be beneficial for complex functions, because now we can go into our active record again and we can change whatever we want. If we touch or if we remove something or if we change something, if we forget to return, for example, here, our tests will immediately tell us. It will show something will be read somewhere and we don't have to worry about that. We can just run our tests, and tests for all of our methods at the same time will run, and we are confident that everything will work as expected. Of course, as long as our tests are covering all the cases, right? But that's why we think about what we need to test, and we cover our bugs here. So here is a homework for you. And this time it's actually two homeworks. You can actually try to make the editing of this page. So once we click on this edit, for example, we need to open a little screen with some text fields that are in essence CMS functionality of our websites. Once we have that, we can call our project the actual CMS. Or if you're more into coding, you can actually go and improve this active record here so that instead of finding by sending the name and the value, you can actually inject one of the objects here in find or in find by. You can inject one filter object that will actually generate this where field and value, and will set all the proper variables here so that you can only list some of the pages here that contain the name page or that are not marked as deleted or something like that. And this is object-oriented core, so you would need to make that object as an active record filter injected somewhere so that these strings are not hard-coded as we have them. So to conclude our video, what we actually did is we have improved our active record here so that it supports the find all and the find by, and it's doing that without code duplication, right? It has a general place where the querying of the database is happening. So it can get one object or it can get the arrays of objects. And we have also listed those pages that we have in our administration inside of our that we have in our database inside of our administration. But we also learn how the tests work, how to write them, and what they can help us with. We showed how tests can make our code much easier to maintain and refactor, because again, we are not afraid to refactor now. We will not be afraid to improve our code, right? We have a little helper in our PC, in our code base, that will actually help us. I personally, again, write simple tests on the most crucial parts of the application, like shopping cart, like payment providers, active records, etc., or the parts that are tricky to test, like this active record again, because it's a bit complex and has a lot of things that needs to be checked manually, so it's much more easier to write the tests. Once you make the first test, the rest is easy. As you've seen, I just copied a few lines and assert a few things. It's very easy to test good code. Please let me know in the comments if you would be interested in a course on testing in PHP, because I was considering making one, and I would really like to know how many of you are interested in it. As usually, here is a joke for you.